One of the major reasons that I dislike even bringing up the topic of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces and the hero's journey discussed within that book, at least within the context of role-playing games, is because most of the concepts that are a part of that storytelling cycle, and those related to it, rely on a central figure in most role-playing, in most storytelling in general. Fate. Fate, kismet, karma, predestination, whatever you want to call it. It's omnipresent across cultural boundaries, and it's one of the fundamental assumptions of almost all mediums of storytelling. I'll discuss this method of storytelling in the context of role-playing games in more detail eventually. But it will be under duress, and only because I have to recognize that it's an essential part of the general storytelling process, like it or not. That, and it might actually have some use in telling stories through role-playing games, as much as I hate to admit it. Still, the whole point of fate in storytelling is specifically to limit what the characters in your stories are able to do, letting you, as an author, take charge and control the action to the degree that you want. Since my entire thesis behind role-playing games is that it's a uniquely collaborative form of storytelling, in which several people come together to share control between them, and in the process create something far greater than any one of them could have created on their own, the idea of sacrificing control so as to conform to some formula of fate is completely anathema to the entire point behind role-playing games on the most fundamental level. Role-playing games are a very new form of storytelling, one that, while it does have a number of fairly ancient predecessors, has really only been around in its modern form since Gary Gygax first invented Dungeons & Dragons back in the 70s. The 1970s, specifically. Interestingly enough, video games as a form of storytelling also began around the same time period. Personally, I think there's a relation between the two events, and likely for the same reasons. People were looking for a way to expand their boundaries, to break free of the restrictions imposed by old orders, as in the 50s, and old standards, and try out something completely new. Because it's so very new, I believe that we've only just begun to really understand the full extent of what role-playing games are all about and what they can really do. Just like video games have improved by leaps and bounds with every advance of technology, so has the thought behind what can be accomplished in role-playing games. Except that where video games are ultimately limited by the technology used to convey the stories that they can tell, role-playing games are only limited by the processing power of the brains of the people playing at the table. With all of that in mind, I don't want to be the one who brings down the hammer and insists that these are the rules for telling stories in role-playing games, creating limitations where they don't necessarily have to exist. I don't want to be like Scott McCloud in his work, Understanding Comics, which, by the way, it is, in my opinion, a fantastic work, and I strongly recommend it to you. But in that work, he laid out the hard rules for what comics are as a medium, and in the process disqualified one-panel comics like The Far Side and The Family Circus from being part of the cool kids' comic club. I also don't want to be like Joseph Campbell, who defined the boundaries of more traditional forms of heroic storytelling, from ancient folkways to Grecian theater to the original Star Wars trilogy. I certainly don't want to be like Roger Ebert, who insisted that video games cannot be art, a view he reached, I think, because he recognized that they were a medium completely different from previous forms of storytelling, and, well, simply couldn't adjust his worldview enough to encompass the new medium at that time, though, from what I understand, he's rethought himself since then, and I'm all in favor of giving a guy the benefit of doubt. This sort of thing happens all the time, and whenever a new medium arises, there will always be opponents, many of whom will declare it illegal, some of whom will declare it immoral. Well, if a cutting edge's impact is measured by how many people are opposed to it, and how prestigious they are, Well, I'd say go and hunt down that old Jack Chick comic that describes how awful Dungeons & Dragons is to serve as my case in point. No, wait, no. Actually, just go and check out the link I provided below to an escapist article covering the subject, since I find chick tracts to be personally offensive on several levels. Pretty much all of them. I've encountered several. They're all offensive. I simply can't bear the thought of providing a direct link to the Jack Chick website and potentially giving him any revenue from more visits. So I just had to filter the comic through someone else's critique. So, no, what I want to be, instead of one of those naysayers and limiters on a medium, I want to be like Harlan Ellison, the guy who wrote the absolutely fantastic short story Repent Harlequin, said the TikTok man. Seriously, if you haven't read that story yet, please go hunt it down and do so as soon as possible. The reason that it's a work of genius, in my opinion, is because it deliberately takes all the hard and fast rules of proper English grammar, one by one, and then very carefully, very deliberately, breaks them. Which, if you think about it, is really the whole ultimate goal in any subject you care to think about. You study a subject to find out where its boundaries are, which is how you earn a bachelor's degree, or its equivalent, and then you earn your master's and then PhD degrees in that subject by breaking those boundaries, if only a little. In other words, you demonstrate that not only do you know the material, but you can actually add new material to the body of work in the field, and then teach others about what you've discovered. For me, I like to think in terms of the martial arts. You get a black belt if you've become competent in all the old methods and everything that's gone before in a given style. In other words, by discovering the boundaries set by all the masters who've gone before you. But you're not really a master of the martial arts until you can break those boundaries between styles and reach a higher plane. Or, as Bruce Lee put it when discussing styles, style is crystallization that is difficult to change. And just like styles, mediums are a form of crystallization. And when you've laid out the rules for fitting into a given medium, when you've declared the hand of fate in your storytelling, for instance, then suddenly there's a loss of flexibility. Instead, I think we should try to realize what Bruce Lee said about breaking out of the idea of styles or mediums. He said it's a process of continuous growth. So yes, there are rules. And yes, there are boundaries. Rules and boundaries can serve as fantastic tools to help us to make sense of the world. But they're ultimately artificial tools, just like the proverbial hammer. They're useful. But as the old saw goes, if your only tool is a hammer, or a saw for that matter, all your problems look like nails. Similarly, if your only tool for understanding storytelling is the hero's journey cycle, then you're setting yourself up to be limited by the bounds of fate, and that's fundamentally anathema to role-playing. Now, being fair, fate kind of has to happen in almost all storytelling, to some degree. If you're writing for a show or a video game, you can't have the actor suddenly racing off in a completely different direction from what the script dictates. A little bit of ad-libbing is fine, as the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields' successes make clear, among others, but overall, if you leap headlong from the boundaries of the script, then everything falls apart. When writing a novel, you've got some freedom, but seriously, most of the very best of books, and especially book series, are planned out from their ending to their beginning. Some of the details might change and evolve in the author's mind over time, but ultimately the characters follow their fate, their foreordained destinies. This is how most storytelling works, because it has to work that way, or else the stories won't ever get written, or if they do, they'll suck, as plenty of bits of experimental junk that's accumulated over the years makes painfully obvious. Please believe me, by the way, on this point. As part of getting my English major, I had to read half a metric butt-ton of that stuff and comment on it as though it were great art. Needless to say, I'm a little bit cynical about what constitutes legitimately great literature these days. So, by and large, if you're going to write something, be it a script for shows and video games, a book, a comic book, a radio play, or webcomics, an academic essay, a cover letter and resume, a report for your work, or whatever, you should plan it out from beginning to end. These works are bound by the demands of fate, and you are the author of that fate, God of a microcosm, master of all you survey on the blank page before you. Try not to let it get to your head. As far as I am presently aware, the major exceptions to this rule of storytelling having to follow the whims of fate or the author are these: improvisational theater and role-playing games. That isn't to say that these forms of storytelling don't have rules or an internal structure and self-consistent logic. They do. But the players involved have a great deal more freedom from the demands of a single author. In fact, one of the major purposes of being a game master isn't to tell your players what they can't do. Instead, your response, in an ideal world, should be to answer all the questions of your players with the phrase, "Yes, but," or as I like to say it, "Yabbit." Can I climb that wall? Can I arm wrestle that giant? Can I outriddle that sphinx? Yes, but, says the seasoned game master. And with that simple starter, or phrases like it, you've both empowered your players, the yes giving them the freedom and power to act, and at the same time the but part helps them to conform to the fundamental limitations of the medium and of your game world, so that they stay on task and actually contribute to telling your joint story. I'm no expert on improvisational theater, except as it intersects with role-playing games, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on the subject. I'll let Wikipedia do that for me. However, it functions on two major principles, which I know intersect very closely with role-playing games: established characters and continual action. I also wish to add the factor of an ending, because if you don't have some sort of end goal in mind before you start, improvisational sessions tend to run on forever, especially if you've got a big troupe who can relieve each other, keeping the action rolling for hour upon day. Similarly, if you don't have an end game in mind when you start a role-playing campaign, then your game has a high probability of ending not with a bang, but with a quiet fizzle in the dark, as everybody just decides they've got real lives that need more attention than their favorite role-playing game. Better, in my opinion, to have a complete story to tell, and parameters in place for that eventual ending, so that you and your players can take away a sense of satisfaction, as well as a host of war stories to share. Established characters is kind of a given when it comes to your player characters. I mean, your players spent some serious time and effort into making those characters, and you bled, sweat, and suffered right next to them in making them. Right off, you know all about them, and you know what sort of development they've gone through, as other videos in this series have already covered. These characters are almost completely out of your control, and that's a good thing. Whenever you're making your plans for a game, or when you're at the table actually running one, always remember and never forget, the player characters are the stars of this show. You aren't. You're the principal writer, director, stage manager, and that guy who picks up the popcorn after the show's over and everybody's gone home. You get your name in the credits, and maybe you'll get to make some nifty articles and videos and so forth, and various social media to explain how you do it. But by and large, if you're taking center stage away from the player characters, then something is probably wrong. In the film Wag the Dog, that was Dustin Hoffman's character's quite literally fatal flaw. He couldn't bear the thought of not having recognition for what he'd done, of letting credit go to others, credit he felt was undeserved. He wanted to be the one in complete charge and get the credit for it, start to finish. That, of course, is the big, huge, massive, ginormous difference between role-playing games and most every other form of storytelling. The main characters are out of the control of the person who's ostensibly supposed to be in charge. There's also the characters that you, as the game master, will be running, which will be the subject of videos to come, but these are essentially glorified props. If you can think of them that way, working with all your might to subsume yourself into the background, and your players get to be in the center of the stage, their characters shining like the stars they are, then you have done your work well, and deserve to feel that sense of true accomplishment that can only come from the labor of love that is game mastering. Probably one of the hardest parts of role-playing games, for me anyway, is to never let the action stop. There's always got to be something going on at all times. Improvisational theater, however, has the answer, which I've tried out and found to work astonishingly well in a tabletop game setting and have already mentioned above. Always say yes, or to use my own phrase, yabbit. So what does that even mean? Well, the idea behind always saying yes is to prompt your players to ask you questions. Get them to start thinking about stuff they might do. Actually, you can just start the process by asking them the question. What do you want to do? You're in a sleepy hamlet, and not much seems to be going on right now. What do you want to do? You're in the depths of the lethal death trap dungeon, and you think you can hear the screams of the damned somewhere down one of the many twisty corridors, all alike. What do you want to do? You're in the bedroom of the Queen of the Elves, and you're pretty sure you didn't get an invitation to be here. What do you want to do? You're in a featureless void, extending off in all directions. What do you want to do? Description, then question, time after time. There's the whole essence of a role-playing game in a nutshell. You've just presented your players with a scenario, and now you've voluntarily given control of that scenario over to them. Use that description to take control of the scenario by defining its most obvious limitations, the ones you can think of right off anyway, and then give power back to your players by asking the question. Of course, you'll be making sure they take turns, even if that means you have to roll dice to see who goes in what order, but when it's each player character's turn, your job is to inform them how they can do whatever it is that they want to do. In other words, provide a probability and a cost. Let's take that sleepy hamlet scenario, for instance. Okay, the party's just arrived in a new little town and don't know anybody. So the first thing they're likely to do is something like telling you, "I want to find out where the nearest tavern is." To which you cleverly respond, "Doesn't look like there is a tavern in this town. That's rather strange, since every other town, village, hamlet, and city you visited so far has had at least 2 establishments for eating, drinking, and socializing, and usually many more." On the one hand, you've just blocked off a course of action by telling your players that what they wanted to do wasn't possible due to practical limitations. The place they were looking for simply didn't exist. On the other hand, you've just dropped a handy clue, which your players might follow up if they'd like. Well, you haven't explicitly asked them the question, "What do you want to do?" In this instance, it's implied. Your silence, after giving them a description of the outcome of their action, coupled with your body language, will tell them clearly that now it's their turn to act once more, preferably on the information you've just given them. Bear in mind, you've got something planned for this town, because of course you do. Maybe it's a bloodthirsty cult, putting on a veneer of respectability so they don't have a tavern so as to discourage people, like the adventurers, from staying too long, and maybe investigating. Or maybe it's a community of pod people, mind-controlled by a central hive creature, and it just forgot some of the expected essentials of a typical town when it was setting up the place as a trap for travelers, which it intended to turn into new recruits. Or maybe the villagers are just members of a fairly harmless religious sect who believe in that stuff like drinking, dancing, music, art, literature, and other such frivolities of life are distractions from one's true purpose, to work joylessly on your land until you finally die of old age and misery, after which you get to go to a fantastic heaven where you can finally get raunchy like nobody's business. Very preachy, no alcohol for miles, but otherwise they're harmless. And who knows? Maybe in that last instance, the players can figure out a way to turn a community like that into a resource for later, such as if they need to get a drunken sage to sober up so they can learn some vital information from the expert, or if they really just need some solid, reliable people who the players know will get a job done when they say they will. They might not be fun to hang around, but at least they can be useful, at least from the perspective of the players. Eventually. But that's part of the process of giving up control to your players. Every time you reveal a new aspect to your world, You've given them another option for their future actions. And honestly, there is no possible way for you to measure all of the possible ways that they are going to throw a monkey wrench in your works. So don't worry about it. Those first two ideas up above about the cult and the pod people, those are Game Master-centered ideas. You making up encounters to drive the overall plot, where you're the one in charge of the scenario. But the other ideas I tossed out, for how the players might make use of this community, if it turns out to be the sober and boring sort, those are the sorts of things that the party would figure out all on their own. Hopefully somebody in your group, and preferably more than one somebody, is taking notes, so that the party can toss this sleepy, sober little town into the pile of potential future tools, and use it later on, most likely at a time and place you never saw coming. But if you're thinking like a proper game master, when the time comes, and they tell you, hey, we'd like to drag that drunk old geezer who knows the location of the next MacGuffin we need over to that town we met that doesn't have any booze. Can we do that? You'll be able to think a moment, then respond, yeah, but. Having said all of that, however, there's always this little caveat to consider. The players don't have to investigate, or otherwise make use of that town, no matter what you did or didn't plan for it. They can always leave and go to the next town instead. In fact, they can do what they like. You've given them a scenario, and you've planned out some potential options, but you're not dictating to them what they have to do next. You should make all the resources available to your players to give them as many opportunities for having fun and working with you to craft an awesome story as is reasonably possible, but you shouldn't force it. If your players seem completely opposed to the idea of taking risks, trying out stuff, or exploring at all, then you probably need to sit down and have an out-of-character chat with them about their role as players and protagonists. But otherwise, sometimes an idea will just click with your players, and sometimes it won't. And that's just a natural part of the process of telling collaborative stories through role-playing games. The more you all practice it together, the better you'll all get. So don't stress out if your players don't immediately hop on every story train station that you give them. But let's say that your players decide to investigate the heck out of this weird little hamlet they've entered, and one of them asks you, "Can I sneak around and observe these people for a while?" To which you, as always the clever game master, tell your player, yes, that's the key word here, yes, you can. But it's going to be difficult since it's broad daylight, there's not many obvious hiding places, and these people know their town better than you. If you fail, they'll probably look at you funny and get suspicious and less friendly. On the other hand, if you succeed, you might uncover some dark and terrible secret. And that's what I mean by probability and cost. Quickly, you've laid out a general idea of how likely the player's character is to succeed. In this case, it's going to be a tough roll, and then what's likely to happen if they fail, in this case, unfriendly townsfolk, and what they might get if they succeed. Cool, sneaky stuff, possibly a reveal on the plot. While this doesn't give away your secret plots, if any, you've given the player enough information to be able to make a reasonably informed decision, or ideally, to counsel with the rest of the party, and together make that decision. Now you let that player think it over while you move to the next player and find out what they want to do, and so on and so forth, all around the table. I'll discuss more about preparing stuff to make keeping that flow of action more smooth and seamless in future videos, but hopefully this will give you enough of an understanding of the concept so that you can start getting used to the idea. When I mentioned the end, when I was talking about points of similarity between improvisational theater and role-playing games, I'm not just talking about the end of a given scenario. That can be included if you and your players agree to it, such as if the players in the suspiciously boring town scenario decide they want to investigate the town's secrets, in which case the scenario ends when they've found out those secrets, if any, or they give up. This is their agreement to the end game for that scenario. It's implied by their investigation in the first place, and implied consent is usually enough, as long as you've established open lines of communication for those times when it isn't. However, what I really mean by the end is the ultimate ending, or the final purpose behind a given 2 to 4 year campaign. As you design each of the little scenarios and side quests that will make up the overall campaign, again, like that tavernless town encounter, always consider the question, does this scenario advance the overall plot? If so, you're good to go, as long as you can also answer the corollary question, how? If not, consider instead, how can I tie it in? Unless the players want to break from the campaign's goals for a bit, and that's fine. They'll eventually tell you if that's the case, and when they do, you should listen, and not stop them. After all, plenty of shows do just that, taking some time out for silly fun, which might actually get tied back into the overplot much later, maybe. Disney's Gargoyles was famous for doing stuff like that, as was Nickelodeon's Avatar and Korra cartoons. Give them a watch to get some awesome examples and inspirations of how to tie seemingly random stuff back into a major plot. But even in the case of these silly little sign vignettes, everything should ultimately advance the plot in some form or fashion. And even if it doesn't advance the plot, then it should advance the plot, just like those shows I mentioned as examples do over and over again. Even if that connection to the overall plot is just to develop one of the main characters, giving them special training, or a cool new toy to play with, or even just to build up the relationship between 2 or more of the characters in the game. All of this, while it may not be directly tied to advancing the end game, it all advances the players as characters, and that in itself creates a stronger attachment to the game. So, always remember, no matter what your players do, no matter where they go, how do their actions advance the plot toward the ultimate ending, whatever that might be? You're the game master, after all, and one of your biggest, most difficult, and most complicated jobs is to see the end from the beginning, and help your players eventually reach that end goal for your campaign, whatever that might be. I hope that at least some of this video will be useful to you as you develop your own process of storytelling in role-playing games. If you want to see more, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And with all of that said, and all of that done, until the next time, I wish you all the very best.